Hi everyone, in this lecture we are going to talk about grid, column and row gap. Now before moving forward, we used gap in our previous lecture. Let's just get it out of the way. Let's talk about it and let's understand what gap actually does and what it is good for. Now before the gap for Flexbox, CSS Grid always had a gap. Because it was two-dimensional, it was necessary to provide a gap. But the CSS, the gap for the Flexbox, it was a long time in documentation and it wasn't supported well by the browsers. Now it has a wide support, that's why we studied it. And the same gap works for CSS Grid as well. And it is to provide space between grid column tracks and grid row tracks. So first let's grab our container. And I'm going to say display grid. And let's create some columns and some rows so we can really take a look at the gap. I'm going to say repeat for 1fr. And the number of sections that we have in here, well, this should be a section. So I'm just going to copy it and I'm going to convert it to a section. I copy pasted this from my resources and I think I did not think it through. So I'm going to Control D and it is going to grab the next instance of that and I'm going to change all of them to div. There we go. That's a good. And let's say grid template rows. Repeat 100 pixels. Save that. Let's come in here. So now we have 4 columns and 5 rows, but all of them are so close together that it is impossible to understand where one column starts and where the other column ends. So let's first talk about the column gap. So I'm going to say column gap. We used to have a grid column gap, and now this grid column gap is actually, here it is. You can see it's crossed through because this is now deprecated. Don't use this. Just use column gap or row gap. But even better than those is the gap property that we used in our previous lecture, which we are going to cover in our next lecture. Weird. 15 pixels. Now it's going to provide vertical gaps between column tracks. There we go. By the amount of 15 pixels. And if you say row gap to 5 pixels, this is going to provide horizontal gaps between or among row tracks. There we go. So this is how we provide gaps universally for all of the elements within a grid container. That's it for this lecture. See you in the next one.